My name's Sam Boon, and this is a short presentation talking about the work that Signet are doing at AHDB, looking at breeding sheep that are more resistant to worms. The challenge with internal parasites is well known. It affects the performance and thus the value of our sheep. It's clearly a health and welfare concern. There are concerns about our over-reliance on drenching and drenching treatments not working as well as they would have done in the past. There's a labour requirement in terms of treating sheep, and also these sheep that are heavily challenged with parasites are also greater emitters of methane. So it's clearly a win-win if we can reduce this parasite challenge. A lot of our work focuses on breeding sheep that are more resistant to worms, but it's also important to have animals that are resilient. So let's talk about the difference. Resistant sheep are those that tend to mount a response to the worm and try and reduce worm numbers in the body and reduce the egg count of worm eggs going out onto pasture. Whereas the resilient sheep are those that can tend to thrive regardless of the challenge that's thrown at them. They still go on and grow well, but they could also be animals that are still putting out significant numbers of worm eggs out onto the pasture. So what we really need is sheep that can both thrive when faced with the challenge and put less eggs out onto pasture, and hence the work that we've done in terms of breeding more resistant sheep. So the options for measuring sheep, there aren't a vast number. You can look at DAG score and how clean your animals are, but that's not a particularly reliable indicator of infection, although we do want to breed cleaner sheep, and so selecting on DAG isn't a bad idea, but it's not a great indicator of parasite challenge. And of course the gold standard would be to look at the stomach contents and actually count the number of strongyles or nematodirus worms within the stomach, but that's not particularly useful if you want to use that animal for breeding purposes, and it would be massively expensive anyway. So what we've tended to use is fecal egg count for both the strongyles and nematodirus species. The advantage is that it is the gold standard for assessing parasite burden. I guess the downside is that it's quite expensive on a per sheep basis. Relatively low heritability, although very similar to many traits that we do already work with of high economic importance. And you do need to put your animals under a positive worm burden. So animals have to experience a challenge, and obviously that comes at a bit of a cost in terms of overall performance. A relatively new approach is the recent one looking at the immune response of the lamb. So using research from the University of Glasgow, it's been shown that animals with high IgA levels, and we detect that through blood samples, they will tend to have less worms of shorter length, and worms of shorter length in the stomach will put out less eggs out onto pasture. So it's a new approach to identifying animals that are good at responding to the challenge set by the worms. It's really important to have variation amongst the results that are sent in, and it's important that animals actually experience a challenge. So here's data from 10 hill flocks. You really want them to be having average counts of sort of 350, 400 eggs per gram. You can see that the flocks tended to be in that range. Relatively few samples with 0 egg counts in them, which is really good from a data point of view. But because it is a balance, the higher you go with the challenge, the better the data, but the greater the impact on the welfare and production of those lambs. So it's about striking a balance. Occasionally we get massively high counts, and just the quick question that crosses my mind at that point with these odd individuals is whether it's actually the worm species that we expect it to be. We did some really good work a number of years ago, AHDB funded work up at Glasgow, looking at speciation from Clin and Romney flocks. And although we always make the assumption that the majority of lambs, the strongyles species, the Telangiectasia circumcincta, actually there's quite a bit of variation. You can see this flock at the bottom with a very high FEC count, but when you actually looked at the species there, we were actually dealing with a Cooperia strain that was putting out very high egg counts and was actually not the target species in this case. So FEC is great for giving us a worm count, and the great thing about FEC sampling, is that the sort of scientific methods that are used in the background are constantly sort of changing and being updated, The systems used by Techion these days have a much greater sensitivity and accuracy, and it's leading to a reduction in the zero counts that we may have had in the past. So certainly the fecal egg count technology is moving, as well as our ability to analyze the trait. So IgA, that's one of our new indicators for worm resistance. So as I said earlier, work at the University of Glasgow, looking at the antibody response to the L4 larval stage of T-circ, and we're using that as a biological marker. So evaluating the data in exactly the same way as any other performance record that comes into Cygnet breeding services, taking into account the age of the animal, the sex of the animal, whether it's a single or a twin, the farm year season effects, all these non-genetic influences to actually tease out estimated breeding values for IgA. Did a little bit of work with saliva in the early days, didn't work terribly well, so now we've reverted back to using blood serum. But when we've done that, we've had heritabilities of around 0.3, 0.35, which for a health trait is really high. Don't assume that it's one and the same as fecal egg count. There's a relationship there in the background, but we do need to think of them as different traits. They're different approaches and ways of dealing with the challenge of breeding sheep that are more resistant to worms. So that's just a very quick slide on the heritabilities. So strong Gars nematodirus typically around 15%, but that's still higher or as high as breeding values of high economic importance, like prolificacy, lamb survival, maternal ability, which is genetics for milk production. And we make really good use of those. So no reason that we can't use these breeding traits in our breeding programs. And as I said, serum IgA considerably higher, which is really interesting. Importantly, we're not really picking up adverse impact of relationships with other traits. We're not really picking up that selecting for resistance is coming at a massive cost to the sheep. We're still finding sheep that grow well, have good maternal performance, and can respond in this manner to a parasite challenge. So that's really encouraging. The data is available on the Cygnet website, so click through for an individual animal and you'll soon find a breeding chart like this one with all the different traits listed. Remembering that for fecal egg counts, what you're looking for is actually negative values. So negative values meaning less eggs shed out onto the pasture. And for IgA, we're looking for positive values, indicating animals that have a better, more positive response. To help us to select for those animals when both traits are being measured, we've got a Parasite Plus, which is a sub-index that takes into account both fecal egg count and IgA. So it's just a very quick way of ranking sheep, which is essentially a parasite-based index. And change is happening. It's always slow when you look at it at a breed level, and a number of flocks are making much, much faster progress. But here you can see that sort of 2014, 2015, 2016, we invested quite a bit of time. The breeders invested a lot of time and money, and AHDB invested quite a bit of money as well into helping to collect samples. And breeders have used this. So you can see they're reducing the overall fecal egg count of the population, and the values of Parasite Plus, that the sub-index, are increasing at the same time. So this is all extremely encouraging, but still needs to sit alongside all of the other traits that are important when you're out there selecting your next breeding ram, such as growth and carcass attributes, and then the traits that ram's daughters will express, such as prolificacy, milking ability, her overall ewe mature size will also influence efficiency. So what are the next steps of this work? The key bit is making sure we're testing enough sheep and doing it in the right way, giving them a good challenge in large flocks under a commercial environment. One of the things that may help us in the future will be genomic approaches. So where we can use DNA to aid our breeding evaluations and give a greater accuracy of our predictions. There are some real logistical considerations there. And one of the things is that flocks will really benefit from working together. So where we find these really high performing breeding lines, it's important that flocks work together, share those breeding lines to make faster progress. And then quite clearly there are the financial considerations as well. So the breeders are making this big investment in taking the measurements. What we need to ensure is that there's a market for those rams, that people are paying a premium for performance recorded rams that have been selected for worm resistance, that then stimulates further investment and the whole supply chain can benefit. It's fair to say lots of people have been involved in this journey. And we won't name them individually, but we've got laboratories here, we've got scientific institutions, academics, levy funding coming in from AHDB and HCC in Wales, and then the support of a lot of breeders. So it's been a massive project to get to this point in time. If you'd like more information, if you head through to the Signet website, you can find the breeding values for individual animals. You can find flocks that performance record near to you, and you can also find information about worm resistance either through fecal egg count or IgA.